All right, let's get this started. Big stretch. Ah. Ba, 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 ba. All right. It's time. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Ricky. This is the Ricky Reading Series. This is our fifth installment, going over Chapter 5 of How to Do Nothing, Jenny Odell's book on resisting the attention economy, which is appropriately, at least in Chapter 5, it was, what was it called? The Ecology of Strangers is the name of the chapter. So we're going to be talking a lot about strangers, their dangers, and lack thereof, and the importance of strangers in the world and in our own fulfillment. So let's get into it. I think this was, like I said, I was kind of chatting before I started really getting into this. It's a very different chapter. It's a break from a lot of what I was expecting or what I was used to, but I think it's gonna be a good time. Let's get into it. So let's recap. Chapter 4, we talked a lot about psychology. We also talked about the importance of externalizing our attention and drawing our attention outward. In particular, we talked a lot about how when we think about social media, when we think about Twitch, when we think about YouTube, when we think about whatever platform you're watching with or using, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc., that there is a lot of money to be made in devising ways to direct and predict your attention. And then with the ultimate goal of really trying to manipulate your attention in such a way to produce behaviors, to click another ad, to spend another 10 minutes on a website, and so on and so forth. And a lot of people like me who have PhDs in psychology get paid a lot of money to do this kind of work. I've actually been scouted a couple times by Facebook, etc., and never gone through with the interview, but I do know a couple people that work there, and they do a lot of research studies, sometimes on people that maybe don't realize they're participating in one. So that was a big controversy we talked about, where Facebook did a experimental manipulation on some 700,000 people, where they were actually manipulating people's timelines to see if they were able to influence their moods. And that kind of research happens all the time, no matter where you're looking or what you're doing. I mean, it's happening right now on Twitch, I guarantee you. And then if you're watching this on YouTube, sure as heck it's happening in terms of developing and refining algorithms to serve you new content that's going to make you do stuff. So, where does that leave us? Even though we have all of these different forces that are trying to direct and control what we are attending to or what we are focused on, with practice, it's possible for us to both learn to better control our attention and also improve our ability to attend to things. So a lot of these same dynamics that are looking for stuff like, let's see if we can get you to click this ad. If you're like me, you get served a bunch of wedding venue advertisements, engagement ring advertisements. If you start to be more critical about the way that you interact with the internet, and also the way that the internet as a whole is interacting with you, you can start to kind of see through the curtain and start to understand things as they are, improving your ability to attend to information and also allowing yourself to be a little bit more fulfilled and a little bit safer on the internet. And like I said before, it's one of the big things here is that there is a lot of money to be made in directing your attention around, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well today. So, chapter 5! 5. What does this actually mean? It was called the ecology of strangers, but it doesn't have that much to do with strangers. It has a lot more to do with society, and particularly whether or not we live in one. The answer is yes. Spoiler. We'll talk about some dissenting opinions as well. But yeah, do we live in one? And we're also going to talk a little bit about natural disasters and what we call disaster psychology, or how people respond specifically to ecological, economic, etc., disasters, and the ways the attention economy influences those. Let's get into it. So before we get into this, the first thing we're really going to talk about is a new ghoul. We talked a lot about Reagan. We talked a lot about Nixon. But a new ghoul just dropped. We're going to talk about Thatcher. Marjorie Thatcher, the Iron Lady, I believe she was called. I know a couple robot VTubers, though. They're much more iron and far more cordial than Margaret Thatcher ever was. Like, this might be one of the most heinous people. Maybe after Reagan. Maybe just after Reagan, the most famous person I've talked about on this series. But specifically, I want to talk about this one very famous quote from Thatcher. There is no such thing as a society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Which is plural line, but in the interest of intellectual, what you call it? Honesty, I guess. I think honesty is the word. I'm going to go ahead and just point out that there is a full quote. So there is no such thing as a society. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look to themselves. It's it gets brought up a lot. It's really, this quote is kind of the cornerstone of Thatcherism, this idea that there is no such thing as a society, there is no broad social contract or assemblage of people, there are just individuals that we're all kind of swimming around in a fishbowl. Sometimes we bump into each other, and the idea that, and the role of government is largely through individual action. So this is, as we think about this quote in the context of the book, a big through line from Odell is the emphasis on collective action, and how being able to communicate and also attend to the same thing in a sustained way, also known as collective attention in the book, it leads to the ability for people to build lasting relationships, establish collective action. And really, this Thatcher quote is in the opposite direction. It's saying that none of that matters. All this idea of collective attention and collective action doesn't really matter. It doesn't even exist. There is nothing beyond the individual, and that there is no capacity for collective action at all. It refutes the very premise. Instead, this bit would say, I know, I'm sorry for anyone watching, we're going to talk about Thatcher for a little while, but it's mostly to make fun of her. So we break it down really here. What we're talking about is ultimately free market libertarianism, which, thanks to Wikipedia giving me the shortest possible definition, aims to maximize autonomy, political freedom, and free market economics. Specifically, like this report came up, looking at the individual as sort of the sole point. Oh God, if you want me to talk about Thatcher, maybe afterwards I'll get into Thatcher. She's an absolute monster. But in this idea of free market libertarianism, and also Thatcherism as an extension, the overall economic project is basically privatization, individual autonomy, and free markets. Thatcherism, and also Reaganism, wraps that up with nationalism, but importantly, I think this is where it really comes down and where we really can tie this into the book, restrictions on labor movements. Remember, we're talking about collective action and collective attention, shared goals, shared beliefs, and how important that is for resisting the attention economy. And yet, one of the core tenets of free market libertarianism, and especially Reaganism and especially Thatcherism, is diametrically opposing labor movements, and refuting them even at the very premise, this idea that these movements do not exist. Because if you take this libertarian worldview, there's no such thing as a movement, because there's nothing beyond the individual. It's just a bunch of individual people doing something, and there's no more significance to ascribe to that. Which, unsurprisingly, means that free market libertarianism, Thatcherism, Reaganism, and in the US, what we have, the current marriage of evangelical Christianity and free market libertarianism, are all incredibly, strongly, extremely opposed to socialism in any way. Because again, if your basic tenet is that there is no such thing as a society, the political ideology that asserts that, maybe people should take care of people is very scary. So remember the dock worker strike from chapter 3? Remember how we were talking about how on the West Coast in San Francisco, the dock workers went on strike, and the people of San Francisco rallied around them and elevated it into a general strike. 100,000 plus people walked off the job in solidarity with the dock workers, which basically which won the strike for them. What we see here is that, oh no, a typo. Oh God, please forgive me. The collective attention in this case of all the people of San Francisco ultimately led to empathy, and that empathy led to collective action. So in this case, again, The police killed a dock worker and a volunteer. The dock workers attempted to erect a memorial. The police took down the memorial. The dock workers came back and said, you know what? Heck off. We're going to go take care of this and reestablish the memorial. But in response to the police violence, they were able to win the attention and also the empathy and collective assistance and solidarity of the people of San Francisco. So again, if you want to take this kind of all the way to the sort of the philosophical level, this is me editorializing a little bit, but if you libertarianism is really opposed to the idea of a society existing in the first place. And I cannot talk about libertarianism without showing a particular clip that is very special. Very, very extremely special. So give me 1 second here. I think this is going to work. Let me know if you guys don't get audio. Looks like you won't get, yeah, it's absolute classic. No audio? All right, give me 1 second to bring up my sound settings. Whoa! That's surprising. Whatever. Give me 1 second to add another audio source. And let's shift some properties around, and that should be it. Okay.
Should someone have to have a government issued license to drive a car?
Hell no.
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
All right, sorry. I gotta dial that one back. Let me give me another one. Give me another one here. It's so good.
Should someone have to have a government issued license to drive a car?
Hell no.
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
They boo him. Y'all got your toast licenses? Y'all got your toast license? What's next?
Should someone have to have
Oh gosh, I can't get over. Okay, I'm good again. But you can kind of see, I don't think there's a clip that better explains libertarianism as like an abstract concept than that exact point. Like the idea that like a person should have, because why do you want to have a driver's license, right? Why does that matter? It matters because having that driver's license would indicate that you have some kind of core level of competency and that some sort of societal body is saying it's safe for you to operate this thing that is basically a brick wall moving at 60 miles an hour on the highway. And then it's like, well, what? If you don't think you have any responsibility to other people, well, then it's okay to operate the death machine because it doesn't matter. Oh God, Aaron, that got too real. That is Anyway, so what good is a society for anyway? Because like I'm already kind of given up the ghost here. I believe in societies. I think societies are good actually, and I think that Odell agrees with me. So Odell brings this example of David Foster Wallace of the fame of Infinite Jest fame in a commencement speech that he gave, in which he talks about being, you go to, let's imagine, hypothetically, in the before times, or maybe in the near future, you're coming home from work, and you stop at the grocery store, and you're tired, and you're hungry, and you just worked a 10-hour day, and your feet hurt, and there's like all these people in front of you in the line, and you know what, that's like, you're in the 10 items or less line, and this person's clearly got 12, but in this example, David Foster Wallace finds a moment where he thinks about the world around him and he realizes, you know what? Everyone else probably hates being here too. And in that moment, he recognizes that he is part of a social tapestry of people that don't want to be at the grocery store, but have to be there in that moment. And the first thing that came to mind for me, so I'm a Chicago native. I was born in the Midwest. I say ope. I drink Malort. I don't think the Cubs are that good. I'm sorry. But this exact photo, I know exactly where this is, and it gives me anxiety. This is rush hour on the Kennedy. It is a meme if you are from Chicago, because it is horrifying. It is dangerous. It is the most stressful driving I have ever done. And getting on there and looking at it, or yeah, Aaron, looking at Atlanta. Atlanta is the second most stressful driving I've ever done, actually. But there is a bit there. As much as I hate being stuck in bumper to bumper, and heaven forbid, bumper to bumper, and then there's some construction, and it goes down from 4 lanes to 2, and it's going to take you an hour to get home when it ordinarily should take 20 minutes. There is a moment that occurs where you might stop and externalize, direct yourself outward, look around, and realize that this traffic jam is full of people, and that you're all experiencing this one moment. And you're all stuck, but you're also stuck together. And in recognizing that, there is power. Because even if someone cuts you off, you're tired, you're hungry, you might start to recognize maybe that person's got to be somewhere. Maybe they're having an emergency. That person has their own reasons, their own feelings, and their own motivations. Remember we talked about the I-it versus the I-thou perspective? If you want to think about libertarianism, it's very much rooted in that perspective of I-it, which is just that, what is this thing and how can it service me? How can this get me from A to B? I-thou is understanding that thing as separate than you, as a separate entity. And when you think about it, like that person who just cut you off, maybe they're having a shitty day. Maybe they're struggling to get home. Maybe they're stressed. And if you think about it, and you think about the society that you all live in, it can open up your experience, which is kind of what we're talking about here, attention and how we spend our attention. So when we think about our defaults, like I was saying, I, it, and I, thou, what we're getting to is a description of instrumentality versus empathy. Do you think about how that person cutting you off is just like an asshole? Or do you maybe think about maybe that there might be a reason that this happened? Fun traffic stories. I've been in one accident in my many years driving. I rear-ended somebody on the highway when we were coming into a construction zone, and I was expecting this person was gonna have at me. They were gonna scream at me. I was freaking out. I was shaking. My car was pretty badly banged up, and I was shocked that as much as I was expecting this person to like scold me and be like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" they were worried about me because they noticed that I was shaking and that I was freaking out and crying, and they ended up actually consoling me on the side of the road. In that moment, I had caused them a great inconvenience. I had hit them in the back. I had rear-ended their car. I was much worse for it than they were, but I got empathy from them. Instead of them being like, "What the hell? Why did you do this? This is gonna fuck up my day." What I got was compassion from somebody recognizing, like, "You've never been in an accident before, have you?" And I'm like, "Nope, I have not." So it was a good moment for me. And in doing that, we can find meaning and connection in situations that might otherwise seem unbearable. I rear-ended this person, and instead they just gave me advice on how to manage the stress and made sure that I was able to keep driving, both in terms of my car and in terms of, well, generally my mental state. And that was a really an important moment for me. Yeah, it was a very good person. I hope they're doing well. But in that moment, even now looking back on it, I was able to break out of that default. Instrumentally, we had both ruined, like I had ruined their day, and I was not very good for it either. And yet there's some meaning and connection that even now I'm sitting here talking to however many people are watching me. And I found empathy and compassion there that I thought was never going to come my way. And so I'm always thinking about this image. Is like the movie has kind of faded from my memory, but this image has really stuck with me. If you ever watched The Hurt Locker, There's the mundanity of normal life and thinking about, whenever I think about grocery stores, this is what I think about now, is this one long shot. It's good. It's haunting. It's haunting in how lonely it is. But the point is, and I think also in the film, it doesn't have to be. You don't have to look at this you don't have to see this experience of being in this grocery store as isolating and alone. You can change your perception in a way that elucidates it and connects you to the people around you. In fact, no one wants to be in the grocery store. No one ever. Also, nobody wants to choose between these 20 different cereals. I'll be real. Come on. Get Lucky Charms. Just get Lucky Charms. They're the best ones. Do it. Maybe Fruit Loops. Fruit Loops are pretty good too. That's a good point. So Raina brings up that traffic jams, even just instrumentally, kind of point out how society works better when people aren't looking out for themselves, because public transport and stuff like buses, trains, etc., really help to alleviate them. And so yeah, it's an interesting thing I hadn't considered, that the whole idea of that everyone looking out for themselves and trying to have their car actually can create problems for everyone else that could be alleviated by thinking about common good and society and all that good stuff, you know? So what is a society? I mean, I keep using this word, and I feel like I need to define it. So Louis Althusser is brought up by Odell to really explain what is the fundamental, the building block. What do we really need? What is the soil from which society grows? And their perception is that society emerged in response to spatial constraints. It is to say that as we shifted from an agricultural mode to an agricultural mode of production, from the hunter-gatherer mode of production, it necessitated that now that we were rooted to a space, we had crops as people, it created lasting relationships that were rooted in shared space and shared activity. And so these extended encounters form that foundation to not only create shared experience, but that experience comes across time to become a shared history, which then becomes the backbone of society. Having shared memories and shared experiences that you're able to talk about with other people is an important stepping stone for being able to say that you do in fact live in a society. And so Althusser would say that it's really about space. And I don't think that's accurate. Because what about virtual spaces? I mean, I'm thinking about how, specifically memes and meme culture. I mean, looking at, particularly, again, like this book was written in 2019. I really wonder what Odell's thoughts on the past year with social distancing and isolation would be, in particularly relationship to space and attention. Because if we look at everything here, it's like we have memes, and those memes create a shared history. And by engaging even in virtual spaces, we develop memes, history, communality. And so I wonder if we're necessarily needing a physical space so much as it's more about a perception of space, an attentional space. For example, VTuber memes. The extent of the society and the culture that's built up around virtual YouTubers is a marvel of the past year to me. It's actually one of the probably, I think, most engaging. Like many of you probably can actually hear this image. But it makes me wonder. Like in particular, I think about these points, especially around like VTuber agencies. They don't really inhabit the same physical space, at least not necessarily. Some of them do. Some of them are roommates. But there's a perceived space that people come into contact with, both as viewers and performers, that they interact in. They create shared history. And that creates a feeling of a society so much that when someone announces that they are graduating or leaving an agency, leaving the space, even if they're not necessarily leaving performing, there's a sense of loss. There's a sense of society there. I don't think you can I think that's something to really think about, and I don't think you can really discount that. And when you're talking about what necessarily is culture and what is society. So I want to bring up a bit here. So we were talking before about how space equals encounters, and that creates history. I think there's one intention. There's one more factor that we need to bring up, and I just spoiled it by opening up my big mouth. It's not so much about space alone. I think you need to have space, and space can mean a lot of things. It can be virtual, it can be in person, But basically, there needs to be sort of a shared focal point for people to direct their attention toward. And that's going to produce encounters. And that's going to produce history. And that's going to, in turn, produce society. So even if you're just playing out in Minecraft or you're watching your favorite VTubers play Minecraft, you are engaging in an intentional activity, a shared moment, a shared encounter that will create history, that creates a sense of culture and society. So yes, at least this is my, again, editorializing. I think that there's something to be added on there. I think COVID has particularly, especially with the shift to Zoom and virtual work environments, really brought up a lot of, I think, interesting dynamics about how people connect in the capacity of virtual spaces to control and maintain human interaction. I know I say it a lot. A person who used to squat this channel and is definitely not me actually did a lecture about this, and particularly about virtual performers and interactions. It's a very interesting dynamic, and yeah, I think that's a good observation, Aaron. It's one of those bits where once you shift your perception, you can break out of the isolation there, even in virtual spaces. And I think that's actually a journey I've gone on recently. Maybe I'll talk about it after the stream. All right. Pain, Pecco. Let's talk about disaster psychology. Paradise and Hell is specifically the name of the book that Odell brings up. So, it's a landmark book. I know there's been some issues in the literature about people talking about the ecological validity of these studies, but suffice to say there have been a lot of historical examples of people rallying in times of disaster to be altruistic. In some cases, extraordinarily altruistic toward their neighbors. And in these cases, sometimes neighborhoods, community infrastructure is able to actually address issues and apply aid faster than outside institutions. There are stories that came out of Katrina, the San Francisco earthquakes, the Fukushima disaster in Japan. There's also like major earthquakes in like Chile and Nicaragua have also evidenced this same phenomenon. And it gets extrapolated sometimes by pop psych writers that in a state of nature, whatever that means, if I could move, if my arms were rigged to move, I would definitely be doing the big air quotes right now. A state of nature. I'm just going to have to pop around it. State of nature. That humans are fundamentally altruistic and pro-social. That when we get away from the confines of capitalism, that people are actually very inclined to help. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think a lot of evolutionary psychology tends to write checks that the research is not capable of cashing. I mean, you just kind of like, you can kind of look at examples in history and just be like, oh, of course, leave the bulb to do this. And then no one can actually falsify it because there's no way to measure it or do an experiment on it. And so you end up with a field that basically is comprised of a bunch of people arguing about whatever their favorite pet theory is with no way of falsifying it. At least that's my knock on evolutionary psychology. I'm not a huge fan of it. And everyone I know that's ever worked in evolutionary psychology has eventually left that field. But like I said, there are other examples of this. So it's not like it's an isolated incident where in response to earthquakes, major disasters, major storms, famine, shortages, like food shortages, people can exercise a tremendous degree of altruism. And so what does this ultimately stem from? Well, if you want to take the, again, extrapolate from Odell's perspective here, it's about shared environments. And when there's a traumatic shift in the environment, it breaks people out of their rote way of engaging with each other, meaning that they now have a shared attentional fixation on whatever the thing is happening is, and in consequence, have a reason to really engage with each other on a more meaningful level. There's a shared thing to attend to. It creates encounters. Those encounters create empathy. They build up into a society, into connection, into culture. And that's fundamentally a good thing, right? Let's talk about the attention economy, because we all gotta come back to the attention economy, right? It's like the specter that's haunting this whole reading series is that it's always got to come back to the way that the commodification of attention kind of gets in the way of our ability to lead our best lives, at least in the way that Odell writes it. Let's talk about algorithms. And I really want to get into one particular way of thinking about this. So for example, I'll pull a personal anecdote. I, at one point, around the release of Resident Evil 8, I wanted to show my partner one specific VTuber clip. And so I went to the YouTube app on my Roku and I put in Pikami Tall Lady. You know, the one with the tall lady. And so for the next 3 weeks, all of my YouTube recommendations were VTubers. I had tripped the algorithm into thinking that all I wanted was VTuber content. And so whenever any major VTuber was live on YouTube, if I went to my Roku, it would be like, hey, you want to watch this, right? Answer was usually no. I mostly just put on beats in the background with that app. But there is a lot of money to be made in trying to develop these algorithms that govern discovery in such a way that they largely serve you what you want, or what they think you want. And what is more profitable, or what is the better predictor of what you will like in the future than the things you like right now? This is my actual Spotify top 10 right now. I'm a very boring person, if you can tell. So it's mostly full of Porter Robinson, anime openings, and one Vocaloid song. So based on my history, Spotify was mostly going to suggest to me old punk bands, chill beats, and VTuber songs. That's basically what I get out of Spotify whenever I open it. Because if you think about it, what is Spotify's business? They want to serve you ads or drive your subscription. The way to get you to want to subscribe is to get you to use the app more. And so there's a big profit motive for these organizations to basically refine and develop algorithms that are going to get you to stay on the app longer. I know it seems like it's very bare bones, but bear with me here, even if it's pretty obvious. So what are some possible consequences of this siloing via interests? I mean, the reality is, I don't very often listen to music outside of these categories because I very rarely encounter it. If I were to leave myself to just the algorithm, I just get served stuff that a machine has probably determined that me or people like me probably listen to a lot, which is why every time I make a playlist, I hit the build playlist based on song. There's always at least 3 Hololive tracks in there that I have never listened to. It's like, hey, people that have listened to any of the things that you frequently do also are also engaging with this other content, which the machine has determined I probably want, which I don't usually. They're not perfect. So what are some potential consequences here? Marx and Engels identified specifically 3 different kinds of alienation under capitalism. Yes, Aaron makes a good point, though. Every one of these Nichi-Sanji songs, Nichiro no Puddle, Wonder Neverland, and then Virtual to Live is further down there. Every single one of those is a banger. Virtual to Live especially is a all-time banger. Like the big dopamine track. One of the few moments where I talk about other VTubers in my reading series. But just go. When I get done here, just go listen to Virtual to Live. Also, the Raindrop songs are good. All right, whatever. I could talk about this for a while. Let's get back into this. So Marx and Engels talked about 3 different kinds of alienation. I want to key into one of them. They talked about the alienation from the product of labor. They talked about alienation from our own creative powers. And they talked about alienation from each other. So this is a nice bit from the socialistworker.org, and I wanna read this for a second here. Although capitalism is always bringing ever greater numbers of people into its orbit, into the labor process, into the market, etc., it does so in such a way that makes us feel ever more isolated from other people. Capitalism encourages egoism and discourages collective action. It pits worker against worker, consumer against consumer in competition for the satisfaction of basic human needs. Capitalism creates rifts between us and degrades human relationships. Now this is a pretty good definition of alienation. And we talked about some of this before. We talked about worker competition. We've talked about the different ways that, say, for example, by increasingly developing a precarious situation for workers by alienating them from stuff like healthcare and basic parts of living like shelter, food, etc., via the commodification of these facets, the system of capitalism has created a point where it reached a point where workers are afraid to ask for better conditions because the crumbs they get are what they need. And especially in the United States, I mean, not an insignificant number of people make decisions based on whether or not their job is going to pay them their health care. Pay for their healthcare. It's a pretty dire situation that we live in. But I want to build on this a bit, and I want to revisit the idea of algorithms again. So in Odell's example, she writes about listening to the radio, and how when you listen to the radio, you know that other people are probably listening to that same thing. Think back to that traffic jam. Let's say it's a nice enough day, you roll down the window, and you realize that the person next to you is listening to the same radio station that you are. There's a connection there. There's a social experience there. No one else is getting Ricky's Top 10 playlist. I hope to God no one else is getting Ricky's Top 10 playlist. If you are, please tell me, and I'm sorry. We can try to make it better. But it does create a weird sense of alienation. And I think that as people are sort of getting together again after COVID, I've heard a couple of examples of this, of people getting back together with their friends and saying, I don't think I really get my friends anymore. Via procedurally generated discovery and algorithmic playlists, it's like their friends had kind of been sorted into camps. And, they get back together and they're like, well, some of my friends, don't play the same games as me anymore. We watch different shows. Some of them have gotten really into VTubers, like really into VTubers. And that difference and that sort of algorithmic treadmill that we catch ourselves on can alienate people from each other. It really can confine us into bubbles where we don't necessarily even really interact with each other in the same way or on the same terms. It's an interesting way to think, because I don't think it's a deliberate style of alienation. It's just profit driven. We want you to click the link, we want you to do the thing. And so the best way to do that is to serve you things that the algorithm has determined you might like. But what might ultimately happen from that is that people end up in individual silos of interests. And the consequence of that might be that you, over the course of a year of social distancing, come back together with your friends and realize that you've now been sorted into very different camps by a machine algorithm. And it might be hard to bridge that gap. I mean, heck, I am a VTuber, and sometimes I find it hard to keep up with what people are saying about VTubers. Which was a weird realization for me. It was like, wait, I don't understand this. Wait, I am a VTuber. What? All right, yeah. So you're saying blue clapper yet again. Like I'm saying here, the siloing of interests via algorithms breaks away from potential social experiences that can dilute our ability to find and create a society, as it were. We're no longer, even if we are attending to things, we're attending to different things. And so filters, media bubbles, personal brands, they're profitable. They're very profitable, but they can also limit our ability to grow and be challenged. Odell draws a line between the siloing of interests via algorithms and biodiversity as well as gentrification. And that's to say that as we start to get homogenized interests, that can lead to a reduction in our ability to be creative and make connection with other people, in much the same way that gentrifiers might dilute the existing framework of a neighborhood, or reductions in biodiversity can have an impact on an ecosystem. In other words, as we get into these dynamics of very sort of blinders on consuming what is familiar and what is good, at least in Odell's point, I don't totally agree with this actually. It breaks this it creates it harder for us to break out of that I-it mindset. Because again, like, that is explicitly what these algorithms are. Serving you media because you already like it. It is an instrumental connection. It's not meant to really be critical. You're listening to Blue Clapper again because you listen to Next Color Planet, and so the algorithm decides that you want to listen to Blue Clapper again. And that's just what happens. And then as you go on, and as these algorithms further refine what you're doing, you might notice that if you're like me, you end up with the Spotify playlist that never really challenges you. It never really serves you anything that you haven't really already been familiarized with at some level. Even my Discovery playlists that are supposed to give me new things to listen to, oftentimes serve me things I've already, bands and albums that I actually have already listened to. It's just figured out that I haven't listened to them here yet. And so the gentrification bit, again, she draws on the historical example of following World War II, and sort of in the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s, what we saw was the children of white flight. It's like of white people moving into the suburbs, beginning to move back into the cities that had rich social tapestries and ecosystems built up, bringing with them brick oven pizzas and craft breweries to replace the rich and vibrant histories that were already there. So when we think about gentrification, we really think about people moving into an environment, pricing out the people who already live there, and supplanting the history that already existed there with what is familiar for them. And so this is kind of what Odell wants to call a gentrification of the mind. That as we get repeatedly insulated into our media bubbles, we start to ignore or forget about things that challenge us or might be different in favor of things that are familiar or are in some way, I guess, safe. Safe is the word for it. A reduction in complexity in favor of familiarity. So this is where it gets a little bit wild here. So this is kind of where this chapter actually started to lose me a little bit. So there is a question that Odell brings up of like, what is an idea? What is the individual? And is it even possible for an idea to exist in a vacuum without interaction from the environment? So remember when we were talking about libertarianism at the jump of this, there's this perception there that there is an essential interaction between the individual and the environment. And so if libertarianism wants to posit there is no such thing as a society, there is only individual men and women and families. Well, Vamers, like my gamers and Vamers out there would probably disagree. But beyond that, it kind of falls down under this scrutiny. If everyone is sort of an individual and there's no such thing as a society, there is no real environment that people act on or are acted on by, where do ideas come from? Where do we get culture and history? One of the core ideas that I really find issue with libertarianism in particular. But our thoughts are inherently connected to our environment. And so Odell again draws the line that enriching our environment is a way of enriching our cognition and in turn resisting the attention economy. And this connects again to the ideas of anti-essentialism that start to come up in the reading. So as we start to direct our attention outwards, as we enrich our cognition, the lines between categories start to blur. We start to recognize that, again, other people are out there, that there are richness and solutions, and there is gray area, whereas before we might have only seen something in black and white, and that it can in turn start to enrich our experience and create sort of the foundation for encounters in history and society and all of that. And so we really need to understand these nuances that exist, attend to them, and really try to challenge ourselves with them. That is to say that there is really no such thing as straight people Mario. If you really get out there, as Mario explores, he might discover that the reality of sexuality is far more complicated than he ever imagined. And then all of a sudden, a whole new world has opened to him. Ugh. Finally, I got to use this picture for something. I saved it like 2 years ago, and finally I got to use it in something academically adjacent. Check that one off the bucket list. So tying it all together, this chapter really went places, and I think that some of the elements were a little bit exaggerated. But to summarize it, there is a profitable industry, aka the attention economy, that exists around serving people more of what they like. Really trying to discover what is familiar, serve people more of that as a means of trying to drive engagement and direct attention, but as either a deliberate or a secondary consequence. This kind of interaction flattens nuance in favor of familiarity and can break down and silo people, like break down the potential for social relationships that can come from stuff like listening to the radio. And breaking out of that mold and recognizing the richness of the world around us, like David Foster Wallace in the grocery store, allows us to really connect with what is important for both us and society, as well as the connections they're in and how we connect to the people around us and how they also connect to us. But I think really what the core of this, and I think what is becoming sort of the core of the book, is that attention is the foundation for empathy. And empathy is the foundation for connection, for solidarity, and for really the future, if we are to have one as a society and as a people. We need to really start to believe in it. We are living within a society. And part of that is being able to break out of these molds, direct our attention where it might need to, like in our own ways, and start to embrace each other in a richness of experience that is antithetical to capitalism, which seeks to get us to engage with the world in the most banal way possible in order to drive profit. So I guess the core idea here is to not miss the forest for the trees. I am still not out of forest metaphors, and you know what? I'm going to keep going with them because I think they're great. But that's what I've got for this week. So there are, I am looking at the book here right now. There is one more chapter and a conclusion left. So I'm thinking that next week is actually going to probably be the finale of this reading series. So getting into chapter 6, restoring the grounds for thought, and then getting into finally the conclusion, manifesting dismantling. So hopefully somewhere in those 1.5 chapters that are left, we're going to figure out what it actually means to do nothing. But for the meantime, thank you all for letting me into your evenings again. Thank you for your attention.